Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a lesson, and it's actually going to be the capstone of a trilogy from John's third chapter. We broke the dialogue, which turns into a monologue between the Messiah and Nicodemus. It's into verses 1 through 12 that describes the born-again experience, and then 13 through 21, which describes, among other things, the centrality of belief, and that word is key in John's. He never uses the word faith. And also the concept of the light and the darkness. But we also meet in what comes after that, the passage we're going to be covering today, the second and final recordings of John the Baptist. We meet him in the first chapter, and we read of the fact of his imprisonment, but we don't read the details of it or the aftermath of it in the passage we'll be covering. But the first time we meet him, he is approached by religious authorities, priests and Levites sent from Jerusalem, and they want to know, is he the Messiah? Because Israel had never seen a man like it in some 400 years. It had been 460 years rather between Malachi, the last recorded prophet, and his promise was that Elijah would return. And John came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, but he denies that he is the Messiah or Elijah or anyone else. He says, I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of Yahweh, as the prophet Isaiah said. So this citation of what we mark our Bibles as Isaiah 43 is common throughout all the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But he says he qualifies that he is spiritually inferior to the one he points to, so much so that he considers himself unfit or unworthy to unlatch his sandal. This was the job of slaves, and he considered himself less than a slave in relation to, and in the 29th and in the 36th verse, he identifies him. He points and witnesses to him as, behold, the Lamb of Yahweh who taketh away the sins of the world. So he had an acute awareness of his sacrificial function, and he also says in verse 32, I have seen the Spirit come down from the heavens like a dove and remain on him. And I do not know him, but he who sent me to baptize in water said to me, upon whom ye see the Spirit coming down and remaining on him, this is he who baptizes in the Ruach Kadesh. So this references the fact, that's all the mention that John gives of the fact that the Messiah was baptized by this man, and the Trinitarian witness is recorded in all three synoptics. The voice of approval from the heavens, the Father in heaven signals his approval by saying, this is my Son, the beloved, the only begotten. And then the Spirit descends in the form of a dove and rests upon his shoulder. We witness the Trinity in tandem at that event. And then he says, I have seen and I have witnessed that this is the Son of Yahweh. So right off the bat, he has an awareness of his divinity. He is born of flesh, but he is also incarnate. He is the Word. Then in the second chapter, we witness him in Cana. This is a town in Galilee, and the bulk of John's gospel pertains to his ministry in Judea. But in Galilee, in Cana, he's at a wedding festival. Unlike John the Baptist, who lived as a recluse and ascetic out in the wilderness, he entered into human affairs. He entered their parties. He entered their weddings. And what he did was sanctify them by his presence, just by being there. And he performs the miracle of the transmutation of the water into wine, which even more longer lasting than the wine, which in all likelihood didn't outlast the festivities, was the transformation of the disciples' faith, which was something eternal. Then we find him in Jerusalem in the first Passover and the first year of his ministry. John records what the synoptic authors record as taking place in his third Passover, the final week of his life, where he clears out the temple, clears out the money changer. He takes it very personally. He says, this is my Father's house. And then he gives the confusing reference to the temple, which, he says, tear it down and I will build it up in 3 days. And then they say it took 46 years to build this temple. This is in reference to the additions that were added to by Herod the Great, the one who ruled before the Romans divided his jurisdiction between his sons. And but he spoke of the temple of his body. John makes note of this fact and mentions that the disciples eventually remembered this. They came to an awareness not during, but after the fact. Then in the 3rd chapter, read a man, a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. He came curious. He also came at the night, and the night would have been the only opportunity to have an extensive dialogue with this man who attracted the crowds and the commotions and everything else wherever he went. And he flatters him, you are a teacher come from Elohim, for no one is able to do these signs, plural. So we only read of the one miracle, but we also read in 2:23, and when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, at the festival, many believed his name when they saw the signs which he was doing. So there is a plurality of the miracles. We read of the one in Cana, but there's many more that come in. Nicodemus intuits that he is sent of Elohim. Then Yahshua flips the conversation into a direction unanticipated. He speaks to him about the need to be born again or born from above, without which one is unable to see the kingdom of Elohim. This confuses Nicodemus, who says in as many words, must I re-enter my mother's womb twice? And then he says, unless one is born of water and the Spirit. So this is a spiritual birth, distinct from a physical birth. That is how we enter into the kingdom of heaven. This is an invisible birth, but something we feel. It's palpable. It stays with us as long as we have the assurance. We can bask in the assurance of salvation. Then he compares the Spirit to the sound of the wind, and that it's unpredictable, uncontrollable, uncontainable, and mysterious, but it is recognized intuitively and instinctively by everyone who has been born of the Spirit. And then he says, if I'm speaking to you through earthly terms, how are you going to believe when I speak to you about the heavens? Then he expounds upon the heavens. No one has come up into the heavens except he who came down from the heavens, the Son of Man. So he condescended to earth in the flesh. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among men. We read of in 1:14. And then the famous, John 3:16, then the purpose for which he was sent, not to judge, but to save the world. Then he expounds on the metaphor of light, and he is the light identified in the 1st chapter, the light in the life of the world, who came, and the darkness comprehended it not. And that dichotomy between the darkness and the light is elaborated on here. In as many words, he explains that sinners prefer to operate in the cloak of darkness and night, and they resist the light. They see it for what it is, and it is blinding to them, where it is illuminating to us who are wise and righteous. But the opening verse of this marks the lesson itself, verse 22. After this, Yahshua and his disciples came into the land of Judah, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. Now, in 4:2, we read that although Yahshua himself did not baptize but his disciples, we can intuit that Yahshua was not in the practice or business of baptizing disciples. This would have been something that his disciples did. They were disciples who were making more disciples, and they were signaling their entry into a newness of life, following his example, of which we read of implicitly in the 1st chapter when John referenced the baptism of the Spirit. He had baptized him in water, and that's how he knew that the one who came to baptize in the Spirit was just baptized. And the baptism of water is signal unto repentance. The baptism of the Spirit is of fire and of salvation. And so they're baptizing, and he's with them, but he's not baptizing himself. And John was also baptizing in Ain, near Salem, because there was plenty of water there, and they were coming and were being baptized. So John was a Baptist. He baptized the Master himself, and the concept or the rite or the initiation was nothing new, nothing original. This had been the Jewish tradition of inducting Gentile proselytes into their faith. They dunked them in water to signal their death to the old Gentile ways. and then rose them. But what was particularly scandalous about John's practice was that he was in the practice of baptizing born Jews, who he democratized their need to be born again and just baptized in water. And the location was it was on the west bank of the Jordan River. So, Yahshua is still in Judah, which, the Jordan River would have ran to the west, but John the Baptist is somewhere up north in relation to him. And the context, the main protagonist of this passage, at least, is John the Baptist, of who it is written in the 24th verse, "For John had not been put into prison." We can read details of this in Mark's 6th chapter and throughout the Synoptics. The reason he was put into prison was his fearless denunciation of Herod Antipas, who was living with his brother's wife, had married her. Herodias was by her name, and Herod, he thought that there was some truth to what John the Baptist said, so he kept him in prison. But the wife wanted him gone, and what she did was sent her own daughter to seduce him by dancing at night. He offered him in a vow everything up to half of his kingdom, and the daughter gave forth the mother's request to have his head on a platter. And Herod regretted having made the oath, but he was bound by it, so that's how they got him. But also in jail, in the synoptic accounts, we read that he struggles. John the Baptist himself personally struggles with the assurance that he was the Messiah whom he sent to proclaim, because he was languishing in prison, and here was a man he had introduced with fanfare, and he had his doubts in prison, but Yahshua assures the disciples, the two disciples who were sent to him, we read of this in Matthew's 11th chapter. But to return to John's passage, "Then a dispute arose between some of John's disciples and the Jews about cleansing." So the matter of ritualistic or ceremonial cleansing would have increased in importance during the intertestamental period. This is what much of the Jews were concerned about, and the sect which took it to the most extreme was the Essenes, who lived out in the desert and formed their own ascetic communities, and John the Baptist had more in common with them than anyone else. But the Jews in this context most likely would have been Pharisees. They chided the master's disciples for not washing their hands before eating food, even the master himself at one point, but he did that purposely to teach them a lesson. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have witnessed, see, he is baptizing, and all are coming to him." So these disciples are jealous and protective of the one they call master. They're bringing to his attention that the one he had pointed to had eclipsed him in popularity. All were coming to him. So they were not gravitating towards John, but gravitating towards the one who John pointed to, and that was precisely the point of John's message, as he makes plain to this inquiring disciple, this worried and concerned disciple. John answered and said, "A man is able to receive not unless it is given to him from the heavens." Now that word given appears about 76 times throughout John's gospel, but in this context, he denotes that everything we can have, everything we claim, everything we can enjoy, every blessing that is bestowed upon us comes from on high and in heaven. So the revelation we receive, the spiritual giftedness we receive, the opportunities to make the most of them really come on high. There is a hand in the heaven who gives us, he is Yahweh Yireh, which is the name that speaks of his bountiful provision. Yireh translates as provider. "You yourself are witnesses for me that I said I am not the Messiah, but I am sent ahead of him." So this reminds us in the first chapter when he denies the interrogating religious rulers and authorities that he is the Messiah, and he's bringing his disciples to remembrance of this, but he existed to point the one. We read Isaiah 40, the version, he paved the way, paved the path for the king, and he was a steward and a herald who came to announce the one who was greater than him. So in order to break the ice between the Messiah, the likes of which Israel had been waiting for an expectation for over 500 years by this point, really, especially, and in order to break that ice, they had to see the likes of a prophet, the likes of which they hadn't seen since Malachi. And John the Baptist's father was actually the first visited by an angel, and he gave him the news that his barren wife would conceive a child named John, who would point the way and pave the path for the Messiah to come. He that has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the voice of the bridegroom. So this joy of mine is complete. So he was content and settled to play his secondary, functionally subordinate role. He likened himself to the bride of the bridegroom, and that is how we, the church, are called, related to the namesake of our religion. We are to be married to him and wedded to him. As the old covenant Jews, their covenant was a marriage agreement, an arrangement. They were to be theoretically wedded to Yahweh and not go whoring or adultering after these other rival deities. Sadly, they were less than faithful, hence the exile and the apostasy. But John, the bride will, he's the friend of the bridegroom, so he's the best man of sorts, and he exists solely for the sake of the bride. He is not there to point to himself. He is there to honor and point to the bride. So he is the friend of the bridegroom. And this was the fullness of his joy, so his joy of mine is complete. So he was content in that role, and he was satisfied to perform that function. It is right for him to increase, but me to decrease. So the concept of increasing means that we diminish in our individual identities, but he increases through us, and this is one of the most common prayers that I pray before I do these things. May I decrease so that thou might increase in me, because when we deflate ourselves, when we consider our identities, our names, our person no longer ourselves but belonging to him, he will increase in us and through us and around us and over us. But we have to get out of the way in order to make his magic come alive and manifest and exert influences all around us. He who comes from above is over all. He who is from the earth is of the earth and speaks of the earth. He who comes to the heavens is over all. So he's referring to the divinity and the origins. Now John has an element of pre-existence. Two of the synoptic authors, Matthew and Luke, speak of his virgin birth, but John takes it back even further. He was there in the beginning, from the beginning, and before the beginning. He created the cosmos and times, and he comes from above, as we read earlier in the introduction. He condescended to the earth, and those who are of earth can only relate to the things of the earth, and they speak of the earth. But he who comes from the heavens, that is Yahshua, the Word incarnate, who assumed the flesh and pitched his tent among men, chapter 1, verse 14. And he is sovereign, so he is the king of the cosmos, and he is the king of creation. And in an act of supreme grace, he came to live among men in order to show them the fullest and final and most authoritative and reliable revelation of who his heavenly Father is, came to us in human form, so we have a relatable model and example of his perfection and his character. And in what he has seen and heard that he witnesses, and no one receives his witness. So the bottom line is that the more profound and accurate and exalted your witness is, the more it's going to be rejected. So the claims of our faith stretch the realm of credibility, yet they are completely 100% true. And we see and we hear, and that's how we witness. We speak of what we see and what we hear, how God has impacted our lives and how he can impact the lives of others. So we have to share him once he's found us, because we don't really find him. He usually finds us. He who receives his witness has put his seal that Elohim is true. So a seal is a protective mark of ownership. That was a seal. The ancients would stamp a seal, which would carry the authority and the weight and the symbolism of a recognized authority. So Caesar had his own seal, but so too does Elohim. And the seal of his is invisible, but it is a witness, and that is how we are secure and protected in his ownership from all evil and all enemies, here and now and forever. For he whom Elohim has seen speaks the words of Elohim. For Elohim does not give the Spirit by measure. So there's two things communicated in this. One, he is Elohim, he was with Elohim, and he was Elohim, and he was with him from the beginning, and he was him in the first verse of the first chapter. And he is the Word incarnate, so he not only embodies the Word, but he speaks the Word. So every word that stems from his mouth is the same as a word from Elohim, because he is Elohim himself in the form of the flesh. And the other thing that's communicated upon it is the unlimited bestowal of the Spirit working in the Son. And there is, strictly speaking, no division of labor in the Trinity, the tandem of the Trinity. The Trinity is always working in tandem. And one example I can think of is the virgin birth, which, though only affecting the Son, was affected by all. We read in Luke 1:35 that the Spirit conceived the Father. The Father conceived through the Spirit the Son. So even though the Son was affected by it, that the phenomenon was brought about by the Trinity in tandem. The Father loves the Son and has given all into his hands. So he loves the Son. He is his Son. He is uniquely and only begotten. We are all his children, but he is his Son. And that does not mean that he is older. It only means that he is functionally superior to the Son, who is sent to incarnate our flesh. But his authority comes with his, so he has the same authority to forgive sins on the earth that comes from him. So the love is signaled by his approval. He is always in the will, always working for his Father, and totally and wholly submitted to him at all places and at all times. And the most pressing situation I can think of is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he prayed, "If there is any other way that mankind might be saved, please let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but what thou wilt." So we have in him the model of the perfect submission that we by right owe Elohim, the Father, and him by connection. He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, but he who does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of Elohim remains on him. So the matter of belief, this takes us to the 16th verse, and we can recite that all by memory, but also in the 18th verse, he who believes in him is not judged, but he who believes is judged already. So belief is once more the nomenclature of preference. We don't read the word faith. Faith is a noun. In John, it is always and only believe. Believe is a verb and action-oriented, so it demands an action. It's not an abstract entity, but something we live into and work into. And if we believe in the Son, that he is who he says he was, he is our atonement, he is our way, he is our truth, he is our life, et al., etc., we will have eternal life that comes from him. But if we do not obey, so many will come to him saying, "Master, have I not preached and prophesied and cast out demons and performed miracles by their name?" And he's going to tell them, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew ye." So there is the possible possibility of coming to know him and not obeying. So once we come to know him, it demands an ethical obligation to obey him in all things and in all ways. It means I will go where you want me to go. I will be who you want me to be. I will say what you want me to say. I will do what you want me to do. And the wrath, that's really the only time we read that word in John's epistle, but is still a frightening and real concept. This is the consequences of unbelief. And one of the things we just want to establish before we close up is that doubt is not sinful. A doubting mind struggles to believe. Unbelief is sinful. This is a mind that refuses to believe. So if you're struggling to believe, you should thank God that you are struggling, because once the struggle ceases, that's when you've already surrendered to Satan and unbelief has kicked in. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.